evening. I would like to talk to you this evening. It will last about 25 minutes, no longer, about the autobiographical nature of these poems regarding both Wilhelm Müller and Schubert. But before we do that, I think we better scotch a misapprehension. Wilhelm Müller is not a second-rate versifier. He's a first-rate poet, and it was Heinrich Heine, the poet of Schumann's Dichterliebe and the Liederkreis Opus 24 and many other great Lieder. It was he who sent Müller a dedicated copy of his Lyrisches Intermezzo and wrote him this glowing letter to accompany a volume of the Reisebilder. I am generous enough to admit to you openly that my modest intermezzo meter, he's talking about poems like Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, als alle Knospen sprangen, da ist in meinem Herzen die Liebe aufgegangen. The my meter does not possess a merely coincidental similarity to your usual meter. I admit too that my Lyrisches Intermezzo almost certainly owes its most intimate and characteristic sound to your songs. I actually got to know your Schöne Müllerin poems at the very time that I was writing my Lyrisches Intermezzo. German folk song influenced me very early on in my career. And later, when I was studying in Bonn, August Schlegel revealed to me many metrical secrets. But I think that it was in your songs that I first discovered the pure tone and the true simplicity for which I was always striving. How pure and clear your songs are. Folk songs, every one of them. Wie klar sind ihre Lieder und sämtlich sind es Volkslieder. And in the same letter, he writes that there was, with the exception of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, no German poet that he so admired. He said that he can think of, there's nobody, dass ich keinen Liederdichter außer Goethe so sehr liebe wie Sie. I love no one more than you. Hyperbole? I don't think so. Heine not only admired the simplicity of Müller's writing, as you'll see tonight, his ability to tell a story directly without the archaic trappings of folk song, he also relished the romantic irony evident in both the prologue to the Schöne Müllerin and the epilogue, and within the cycle itself. Heine also set Müller above Ludwig Uhland in his survey of German romantic poetry. He called it die romantische Schule. And that's a huge compliment. Uhland was a wonderful poet, much favored by Lieder composers, and there's absolutely no doubt that Müller's Die Winterreise owes a literary debt to Uhland, whose Frühlingsglaube, a song I think we all know, was immortalized by Schubert in 1820, at the very time that Müller was writing Die Winterreise. Uhland's poems had been published in 1815, and they included a section of 9 Wanderlieder. Both Müller and Uhland used similar imagery: frozen landscapes, darkened suns, cold winds, falling leaves, deserted pathways, and both protagonists set out on journeys. Schubert, incidentally, knew these poems. They had been set to music by Konradin Kreutzer as 9 Wanderlieder von Uhland in 1818, a decade before Winterreise. And Josef von Spaun, in his memoirs of Schubert, told an anecdote of how Schubert reacted to Kreutzer's Wanderlieder. I quote, "We once found him playing through Kreutzer's Wanderlieder, which had just been published. One of his friends said, 'Leave that rubbish, leave that trash alone and sing us a few of your own songs. Lasse das Zeug und singe uns ein paar Lieder von dir.' Whereupon Schubert replied tersely, 'But you are unjust. The songs are very beautiful, and I wish I had written them. Ihr seid doch ungerecht. Die Lieder sind sehr schön, und ich möchte sie geschrieben haben. So Müller, when you listen to these songs tonight, do not think that he is a poetaster, a third or fourth-rate versifier. He simply isn't. So let's now turn to the biographical nature of these poems. To what extent do they mirror Müller's own experience? How could he, who by his own temperament by his own testimony, was happily married and respected as a teacher and ducal librarian, how could he pen such poems of existential angst? Was he simply playing with the Weltschmerz game and adopting a pose of world weariness? Or were the poems an expression of the liberal poet disappointed in his Vaterlandsliebe, a cry from the heart of a disappointed warrior in the wars of liberation? He fought in 4 of the battles against Napoleon. Or was he, although seemingly content in his marriage to Adelheid Basedow, was he exercising an unhappy love affair from his soul? I'd like to argue that all 3 reasons help to explain the mood of these poems. But above all, the poems Die schöne Müllerin and Die Winterreise, by the way, the title of Müller's cycle is Die Winterreise, Schubert ditched the Teftet article. They hark back to 2 unhappy love affairs that Müller never quite got over. The first of these has been well documented and is known, I think, to a lot of you, to lovers of Die schöne Müllerin. In the winter of 1816 and 17, Privy Councillor Friedrich August von Stegemann and his wife Elisabeth, both of whom were published poets, they organized in their Berlin home evenings of literary charades to entertain their adolescent children, August and the 16-year-old daughter Hedwig, the original Schöne Müllerin. Among their guests were Clemens Brentano, he of the Des Knaben Wunderhorn, the 22-year-old Wilhelm Hensel, the painter, who was soon to marry Fanny Mendelssohn, his 18-year-old sister Louise Hensel, and of course Wilhelm Müller, then aged 23. The charades must have been emotionally fraught, since both Brentano and Müller were in love with the nubile Louise. Brentano actually proposed marriage unsuccessfully. Shy, like the Schöne Müllerin's hero, the younger Müller confided his own passion and his despair to his diary. His obsession with this young lady, who was, by the way, a poet, I got her poems at home, some of them are really rather good. It's apparent throughout the diary from October 1815 to December 1816. He's tortured by the thought that she might not return his love. He expresses his delight at Louise's gift of a songbook. He shows her his own poetry and favorite pieces by other writers. He worries about her health and often ends an entry with the words, Gute Nacht, Louise, a phrase that was to provide the title to the opening poem of Die Winterreise that Schubert later adapted for his own Winterreise. And Müller, in his diaries, he explains how he stands outside a house where Louise was attending a ball. Gute Nacht, Louise, he sighs, and wonders whether she has heard him. He looks at the moon and takes delight in the notion that she too might be looking at it. And returning from a visit to her home, he passes the church where she prays each Sunday and wallows in the thought that he might one day marry her there. She tells him that he ought to become a theologian, and he wishes, touchingly, that he had the money to enroll for a theology course at university. When Louisa fell dangerously ill, he describes in detail how he held her hand, and a few weeks later, he describes the thrill of kissing her on the cheek for the first time. He dreams of her all night long. The diary has none of the romantic irony that suffuses Die Winterreise, as we see in this entry for the 8th of November. The German is so easy that I don't think it needs a translation. Luise, ich liebe dich. Luisa, ich liebe dich. Luisa, ich liebe dich. Immer und ewig, always and eternally. Hier und dort, here and there. Luisa liebt mich auch. Luisa loves me too. Das weiß ich, I know. Ob sie es mir gleich nicht gesagt hat, even though she hasn't told me. Immer und ewig, hier und dort. Gute Nacht, meine Luisa. Despite such euphoria, he worries about whether she really does love him. It's clear that she was fond of him, but her religious scruples prevent her from being anything more than a friend. In one of her poems, one of my favorite poems by Louisa Hensel, it's called Die 17-Jährige auf dem Balle, the 17-year-old girl at a ball, at a dance. It makes her position clear. She writes that her beauty will fade, and it will be better for her suitor, and she means Wilhelm Müller, to worship eternal beauty and God. The diary contains some of their conversations, and the mode of address is always formal. Sie, never du. And as for her own poems, Müller tells his diary that he finds them dark, without love, tired of life, filled with a longing for the afterlife. Düster, ein Sehnen nach Jenseits, ohne Liebe. On Christmas Eve 1816, Clemens Brentano is mentioned for the first time in the diary. I spent Christmas Eve at the Hensels. Louisa gave me a songbook. Brentano was also there. This lapidary statement conceals the turmoil Müller must have felt about his rival. It seems that Brentano's passion for Louisa scuppered Müller's romantic dream. Müller's wooing of Louisa had been essentially based on the medieval idea of courtly love. Brentano's approach was more sensual. Louisa, however, never married. She converted to Catholicism in December 1818 and devoted her life to religious good works. Given the depth of Müller's feelings for Louisa, the trauma he experienced when they went their separate ways must have fed into the Winterreise poems. A much less documented affair, and even more germane, is the physical relationship that Müller enjoyed with a Walloon girl during the Wars of Independence against Napoleon, a decade before he wrote the first poems of Winterreise. Of all Müller's love affairs, this was the most traumatic, and he never really recovered from the emotional anguish it caused. So, who was this woman who bewitched him in Brussels when he was a raw 19-year-old soldier? We can glean something from a diary entry of 15th of October 1815, at the height, incidentally, of his passion for Louisa. Towards evening, I copied out the majority of Louisa's poems. Having finished this task, I went to my office and looked at the mementos of my Brussels love affair. I was wondrously affected. The old love for Louisa for this woman seemed to reignite, especially when Therese's curls seemed to waft her very breath at me. I could not resist kissing the curls, and I experienced a most strange feeling of having kissed Teresa herself. Miraculous. And yet, Louisa, my heart remained just as true to you and warm as ever, which implies that we shall meet again in heaven. Her name then was Teresa. Another diary entry, a week before, refers to the turmoil and tears that the affair caused his family. I quote, "A year ago, I spent my birthday in Brussels. I don't quite remember how, but on this day I wrote a letter which cost myself and my father untold tears. Thank God that I have now come through all that. The past year now lies so far behind me. The reason for these tears and this emotional upheaval were twofold. Firstly, Müller's sweetheart, Therese, was a Walloon. He was therefore fraternizing with the enemy, he, a 19-year-old soldier, which was a court-martialable offense. Secondly, if there had been premarital sex, which the tone of the diaries suggest, he would have been punished by church and by state. Typical punishments in the early 19th century were fines, imprisonment, and public atonement. Anyone who doubts this should reread the Grecian story from Faust. That something cataclysmic occurred is suggested by a sequence of wonderful poems that Müller wrote, their sonnets, the so-called Brussels sonnets, in which he significantly did not publish during his lifetime, a very rare occurrence with him. They only appeared in 1902 after the death of his son, Max Müller. The sonnets deal with a love affair that caused, as we've seen, Müller and his parents endless torment. Müller attempted to exorcise his anguish by writing these sonnets, in much the same way, incidentally, that Eduard Mörike tried to exorcise the spectre of Maria Meyer by writing the Peregrina poems. Or as Goethe put it in the wonderful play Torquato Tasso, the Italian poet who's much mocked by the court and unhappy in love, Goethe writes, or puts into his mouth, Und wenn der Mensch in seiner Qual verstummt, gab mir ein Gott zu sagen, was ich leide. Though in their torment men are dumb, a God granted me the gift of expressing my grief. Once again the German, because it's just so wonderful. Und wenn der Mensch in seiner Qual verstummt, gab mir ein Gott zu sagen, was ich leide. These sonnets tell of the bitterness, the disillusionment, the disappointment, the doubts and the melancholy of a man who had entered the wars of liberation with such idealistic emotion and who now spends his life like a lebendig Toter, like a living corpse. The sonnet I'm about to read in translation inhabits the same mood as many of the later poems from Winterreise. This is so bitter. The old God with the white beard that you depicted in my child's primer, the old God who, according to your Bible, maintained a single race to honor him, the God to whom, with holy gesture, you sing pious hymns in your churches, to whom you bring your sacrifices in heaven, and whom you banish from his own earth, I deny him. The die is cast. Go ahead and strike me from your list, an antichrist, an atheist. As a pious hypocrite, I could praise you, but where you pray, my mouth can only curse. And where you curse, I must seek my God. Ich leugne ihn. Der Würfel ist gefallen. Streicht mich nur immerhin aus euren Listen, als Antichristen und als Atheisten. Als frommer Heuchler könnt ich euch gefallen, doch wo ihr betet, kann mein Mund nur fluchen, und wo ihr flucht, muss meinen Gott ich suchen. One's reminded of the 22nd song from Winterreise, Mut. If you remember it, cheerfully out into the world against wind and storm. If there's no God on earth, then we ourselves are God. Lustig in die Welt hinein, gegen Wind und Wetter. Will kein Gott auf Erden sein, sind wir selber Götter. Blasphemous. Let's now turn to Schubert. Why was he so affected by these poems? I would like to focus on Gute Nacht and Die Wetterfahne. Just think how Schubert must have felt when he came across these lines from Gute Nacht. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von Ehe. The girl spoke of love, her mother of marriage even. Schubert, I'll explain in a minute. And think of these lines from the Wetterfahne. Was fragen Sie nach meinen Schmerzen? Ihr Kind ist eine reiche Braut. Why, what is my torment to them? Their child is a rich bride. So what is the significance of this? Well, we know little about the workings of Schubert's heart, but we do know that he was fond of Therese Grob, the 16 or 17-year-old soprano who sang in the 17-year-old Schubert's Mass in F, a really lovely early work, at the Lichtental Parish Church on the 16th of October, 1814. 3 days later, still aged 17, Schubert composed Gretchen am Spinnrade, one of the great miracles of the Lieder repertoire, which she presumably performed. She was a year younger than Schubert, and Schubert was clearly infatuated by the young soprano. She was apparently kind and enthusiastic about Schubert's music. Her mother was a friend of Schubert's family and ran a small silk weaving business. And two of Schubert's close friends, Anton Holzapfel and Anselm Hüttenbrenner, mention Schubert's love of Therese in their memoirs. Hüttenbrenner actually quotes, tantalizingly, Schubert's own words about Therese, and in translation. I loved someone very dearly, and she loved me too. Ich habe eine recht innig geliebt, und sie mich auch. In a mass which I composed, she sang the soprano solos most beautifully and with deep feeling. She was not exactly pretty, and her face was pockmarked, but she had a heart of gold. Sie war eben nicht hübsch, hatte Blatternarben im Gesicht, aber gut war sie, herzensgut. For 3 years, she hoped that I would marry her, writes Schubert, but I could not find a position which would have provided for us both. She then bowed to her parents' wishes and married another man, which hurt me very much. I still love her, and no one has since appealed to me as much. She was simply not meant for me. Ich liebe sie noch immer. I still love her, aber sie war mir halt nicht bestimmt. And Holzapfel describes her as well-built, rather plump, and with a fresh, childlike round face. Gut gewachsen, ziemlich voll, ein frisches, kindliches Rundgesichtchen. Holzapfel tried to dissuade Schubert from entertaining hopes of marriage, to no avail. Schubert continued to write works in which Therese performed, and he wrote out later 17 of his own songs, which he presented to her at a later date, and she had bound together. It's a bibliophile's gem. There was, of course, no possibility of Schubert marrying her. During January 1815, in the repressive regime of Metternich's Vienna, a new law on marriage was introduced, the so-called Ehekonsensgesetz, the marriage consent law, according to which a man could only marry if he could prove that he had sufficient means to support a family. That Schubert wished to marry is clear from a diary entry of September 1816. Happy is he who finds a true male friend. Happier still, he who finds a true friend in his wife. Glücklich, der einen wahren Freund findet. Glücklicher, der in seinem Weibe eine wahre Freundin findet. In the very next entry, he describes what it was like for a man who wished to marry to remain single. Melancholy and sensuality will be his lot. Trübsinn und Sinnlichkeit. Schubert was not in a position to marry. In April 16, he had applied for the job of Kapellmeister in Laibach, and despite Salieri's glowing reference, his application was rejected. Therese eventually married a master baker, Johann Bergmann, who had the necessary wealth to support her. So when you hear tonight, Ihr Kind ist eine reiche Braut, listen to how Florian actually vocalizes that. It'll be full of bitterness. Sensuality is what Schubert fell prey to, contracting syphilis from a prostitute, probably sometime in 1822. But rather than give in to depression, he composed Die schöne Müllerin and Winterreise, identifying with the lowly journeyman miller and the rejected lover. It's interesting, I think, that Müller indicates that his hero was a writer, or perhaps a musician. In the Lindenbaum, he carves his name, or her name, on the bark of a linden tree. In Auf dem Flusse, he carves her name into the ice, and of course, in the great song that finishes this cycle, Der Leiermann, he asks the hurdy-gurdy man if he will grind his organ to his own songs. Willst zu meinen Liedern deine Leier drehen? The poetry of Die Winterreise is laced with the sort of romantic irony that was so admired by the cynical Heine. Because of Schubert's music, we hear these poems mostly as romantic effusions of a jilted lover. But that is not how they should be recited as poems. And I think every singer ought to listen to a great actor reciting these poems. And I thought we would end by hearing one of the most celebrated of German actors, Gerd Westphal, read both Gute Nacht and Die Wetterfahne, which I've just talked about. Listen for the self-mockery, the sardonic laughter, the anger, the self-loathing, the colloquial delivery. Schubert, I think, misunderstood the tone of some of these poems, and we've been eternally grateful ever since. But a great Lieder singer like Florian Boesch is able to color Müller's words in such a way for us to appreciate the anger, the despair, the self-mockery, the blasphemy behind Schubert's beautiful music. And I think it's probably right. Though perhaps we could have the text now, Ruth, and listen to how this is spoken. He first introduces the cycle.
Gedichte aus den hinterlassenen Papieren eines reisenden Waldhornisten, herausgegeben von Wilhelm Müller, Lieder des Lebens und der Liebe, die Winterreise. Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus. Der Mai hatte gebogen mit manchem Blumenstrauß. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von Ehe. Nun ist die Welt so trübe, der Weg gehüllt in Schnee. Ich kann zu meiner Reisen nicht wählen mit der Zeit, muss selbst den Weg mir weisen in dieser Dunkelheit. Es zieht ein Hundesschatten als mein Gefährte mit. Und auf den weißen Matten suche ich des Wildes Tritt. Was soll ich länger weilen, dass man mich trieb hinaus? Lasst irre Hunde heulen vor ihres Herrn Haus. Die Liebe liebt das Wandern, Gott hat sie so gemacht. Von einem zu dem anderen, freien Liebchen. Gute Nacht, will dich im Traum nicht stören. Er starb in seiner Ruhe. Sollst meinen Tritt nicht hören, verzach die Tür zu. Schreib im Vorübergehen ans Tor hier, Gute Nacht, damit du mögest sehen, ich habe an dich gedacht. Der Wind spielt mit der Wetterfahne auf meines schönen Liebchens Haus. Da dachte ich schon in meinem Warme, sie pfiff den armen Flüchtling aus. Er hätte es eher bemerken sollen, des Hauses aufgestecktes Schild. So hätte er nimmer suchen wollen im Haus ein treues Frauenbild. Der Wind spielt drinnen mit den Herzen wie auf dem Dach. Nur nicht so laut. Was fragen Sie nach meinen Schmerzen? Ihr Kind ist eine reiche Braut.
I think it's apposite to end with giving you a description of Schubert. He was 5 foot tall. He was fat. His nickname was Schwammel, little mushroom. He was myopic. There are many eyewitness accounts of him losing his specs, like we all do, and they were almost always on his head. Talking of his head, his hair was falling out and he had to wear a wig. The hair was falling out because of the treatment, the mercury treatment for syphilis. I find it almost unbearably poignant that this great genius, who only had one concert in his lifetime dedicated to his own music, and who, as far as we know, never enjoyed a consummated relationship with a woman, should pour out his soul in these wrenching songs of unrequited love. Thank you.